think we're probably close. Can everybody hear that? Yep. I guess we're probably close enough to go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself. I'm Andre Mitcrin, my co-presenter, Andrew Dunstan. I'm a contract VP with Connection Technologies. I do the systems development there. I also have a small consulting company and have been a Postgres fan and Postgres users for, I don't know, at least 8-10 years as far as I remember. It's hard to tell exactly which years, but been using it quite a bit and sponsored a couple of projects for Postgres. So the first question comes up is, why in God's name would anyone build a billing system? Well, the answer is nobody in their right mind would start off and plan on building a billing system, and we didn't either. What we did was we went out and we bought a billing system. We did a careful evaluation that took a couple of months. We looked at all the big players. We figured out which one was the most flexible one. We turned around and bought it and then spent a few $1,000,000 trying to implement it, and it didn't work. We couldn't get it to do what we wanted to do. And a lot of it is because the company is driven, what I call a sales-driven company, where the CEO was a great salesman, probably one of the best in the industry, and can sell ice cubes to Eskimos, and he basically let the sales force run wild. And so the issue they ran into was that there's about 11,000 micro markets. In each of those micro markets, probably about 15 or 20% has a contract. And each of those contracts has individual pricing and individual terms. And so it's not the usual thing that you'd expect a telco billing system to do, which is people make phone calls, you have rates, you charge them certain rates. No, on some properties, on some developments, you do things like it's free. That's it. It's part of your HOA dues, just like being able to use the swimming pool. On some properties, it's free in North America, and you get this rate in Europe. And by the way, they charge for Canada. On another property, they don't charge for Canada, but they do this and they do that. And the rules, and it's not just voice, it's voice, video, data. And then they got into some bizarre services where they were actually hawking HD TVs as part of it. So you can imagine a telco billing system hawking HD TVs and charge. In some cases, the customer bought them. In some cases, the customer rented them, which was even more bizarre. So at the end of the day, after a lot of trial and error, we found the best commercial system we could get our hands on, spent the money, and then the problem was it took about 8 hours to re-rate one property, and there's 11,000 properties. So we thought, well, we could make it up in volume and buy a huge number of machines, but that ended up being many millions, and it just really wasn't practical. So then the reason for building a billing system is, one, you're a glutton for pain, or two, you really didn't have any other choice. And once you get into the taxation portion of billing, it's just the worst headache. There's at least 280,000 or so line items in the tax tables that we use. So good luck figuring that stuff out. Now, we didn't just build a billing system. We actually needed a whole OSS, BSS suite. So I don't know if does anyone here work for a telco or worked for a telco in a past life? A couple of folks have. Okay. So, of course, the first thing you have is, this is I'd call a slimmed down version of everything that's involved. And anyone who's worked at a company that does multiple services probably realize that this is a small fraction of what you have to do. Of course, we have a call center. We've got field techs. We've got contract field techs, so they've got to be able to have tickets and work orders and service orders. There's the contract manager. This is where the CEO, sales guy, went wild selling stuff and created a lot of complexity. There's a whole property management system. There's, of course, the billing system with this one item in it. There's account management. The people want to be able to get on, order their own services. They want to be able to get on and pay their bills online. They want to be able to see their bills. That's all part of self-care. There's a whole project management system because you've got to go in there and install head-end buildings. You've got to install routers. You've got to install equipment. There's a whole project management system that's built in. Facility provisioning, blah, blah, blah. So this thing started off as a 2-month contract when I first started there, and I built a small property management system on top of Postgres. And I thought, okay, good, I've got the contract done, I've moved merrily along my way. And eventually this ended up as, a whole OSS, BSS suite for a company that's probably got about about $600 million in funding into it right now. Of course, all the things that you want with billing, but people can read slides. This is, again, just kind of a dumbed-down version of all of the things that you have to do with billing. But the things that were the most painful ones is taxes were very painful. The main reason is the government authorities just cook up crazy things that I would never have thought of. Like the most insane one I found was taxes on taxes. And so you read the manual and it says, oh, if you have all these taxes, there's a tax on the tax. But then now you've created another taxable item when you've created the tax on the tax, so you have to do the tax on the tax on the tax. But of course, now you've created another taxable item, so you have to do it again. So, and then you read the manuals and the documents to tell you just how many times from this vendor you have to do the taxes on taxes, and it doesn't tell you. So then you have to go to the legal department, and they go, well, if you do it about 4 times, you're probably okay. It's like, who would have thought of such a crazy thing? But no, they did. So that was one painful part. The other one is there's a lot of things that you have to do, the AR, the AP, all that stuff. We actually just use Great Plains to do that. So this isn't a complete billing system in that we don't maintain the account balances in the software that we wrote. We do the rating and we do the taxation, and then we push the invoices into Great Plains, and and of course, you have to decide who the customer master is and who's the master of the balances. The Great Plains system is the master of the balances, and the system that we wrote is the master of the customers. So it keeps track of who the customers are, where they live, and it's considered to be the authority. And that can only be changed within the system that we built. A couple of other things. You've got self-care out there. People want to see their bills, so we had to be able to actually create nice-looking invoices. And we did that by generating some XML, and Andrew will go into the details of exactly how we did that. But we generate the PDFs. We do send the PDFs off to the printers. Not all of them get printed, but for the ones that do get printed, we also have to show them not only to the customers on self-care and be able to mail them out, but also the call center. People want to come in there and complain about the bills. And they say, well, on page 4, line 5, so we've got to keep the PDF somewhere online and be accessible from inside the call center. Then on top of that, it gets a little worse. You can't just build a billing system. What is it that you're building? Through the various contract negotiations that took place, I think there's somewhere on the order of about 2,200 items in the product catalog. And inside the product catalog, there's actually a lot of dependencies. So you can't order the Russian channel unless you bought the premium package, and you can't get the premium package unless you got an HD receiver, and you can't get an HD receiver unless you're connected to this other kind of device, and you can't have that unless you have this other thing. So there's a whole, the dependencies actually turn out to be many to many, and they turn out to be hierarchical as well. And so that was something we had to build into the product. So we had to build the product catalog on the fly, too. So that was kind of exciting. You had to, of course, someone's got to keep track of the GL codes and the tax tables. Fortunately, there was a vendor that provided the tax tables, I think CSV format. No, they weren't. We had to turn them into CSV format or some other crazy format. Andrew probably remembers. He's the one that did that. But we had to get the tax tables loaded and be able to do lookups. And Andrew did some pretty clever things there to cache it, because otherwise the performance wasn't where we wanted it to be. The contract terms, I think the biggest complexity we had to face with is some of the customers just get the services for free. And they get it as part of the bulk package, it's part of the HOA dues. And some of them pay for it. And then every property has their own pricing schemes. Some of them last for 5 years, some of them last for 10 years, some of them last for 12 years. Sometimes the billing and the service is actually provided by a third-party company. It could be one of the major vendors, and then they pay an infrastructure rent to be able to use the fiber that's running to the home, if this was a fiber to the home property. And of course, to be able to win certain contracts, the marketing people thought up of every kind of wild, crazy promotion that you could think of. And so some promotions only applied to certain properties. Some of the promotions, an added complexity was they're only available on certain products at certain properties, and so the dependency engine also had to be able to handle the dependencies with promotions. So before long, the dependency engine that we ended up building, which was completely done in Postgres, natively in PGSQL, it had to handle dependencies between services and devices, dependencies between services and promotions, and now there's this whole specialty suite that's for the reseller arrangements, because the company entered into some reseller arrangements, so they resell signals for DTV through another provider. And then, of course, there's screw-ups, so you've got to be able to apply credits at the account level, apply credits at a service level. You've got special promotions that span multiple months. And so if anyone's written any code, you can imagine all the issues that you run into when the billing cycle's in the middle of the month, and then months overlap, and so on and so forth. So that's just some of the ideas of things we had to deal with. And then, of course, the other one is for people who haven't done billing. There's non-recurring charges and recurring charges. The issue here is the non-recurring charges, you want to bill them on the current month, but the monthly recurring charges, you want to bill it forward 1 month. But of course, now when the customer, yeah, I can see the smile. Now the customer decides to cancel their services. Well, you owe them money. How much money do you owe them? Of course, you've got to go calculate those days. And guess what? If you're off by a day and you have enough customers, you're going to get a sudden flood of calls that you didn't give me back enough of a credit. It's off by 32 cents or some wild amount. And they tie up the whole call center dealing with the fact that the credit wasn't correct. And of course, then there's usage charges. Sometimes some things like video on demand, you've got to charge for that. Long distance, you charge for that, so on and so forth. And another, I didn't actually create this slide. My boss, who loves to make PowerPoints and present this to upper management, he created a really cool PowerPoint to explain it all. But in general, you get the idea that some things are billed forward and some things are billed backwards. And then we had to deal with a lot of complexity, how far backwards. There was some issues associated with that. So we ended up having to build variable-sized windows depending on how far back you want it to go. Now, you can imagine this company was a relatively new company, and so everything was done at high speed on the fly, and there were a number of data quality issues. And so we ended up having to address those as well. And there's a whole list of them. There's actually about 30 or so data quality issues that we cover. And before we added these DQ checks, before we would do billing, we ended up 50% of the calls into the call center were billing related. There were 6 commercial billing systems that came through acquisitions of companies, or were the original commercial system that was bought and implemented, or some things like that. And so when we started writing the billing code, we realized if the billing engine itself, the rating engine, had to deal with all the complexities of all the screw-ups in the data that could possibly exist, then the billing code would be a set of if-then-elses or case statements or God only knows what, or a monstrous rule engine trying to deal with all the data problems that we came across. So what we decided to do was we ended up building a whole DQ system that actually goes through and does data quality checking on the customer. It actually goes through and does all the data quality checks to ensure that the data for a particular property is all there and that it's rational. And there's probably not much point in going into the details of what all the DQ checks do. Of course, the system itself has to keep track of all the different kinds of subscribers, which there's no shortage of. There's some of the properties were fairly high-end properties, so you end up with, Bill Gates' father and movie stars living there. And then some properties, a fair number of them, is the NASCAR and beer crowd, and we end up having to implement one. Yeah. And one of the more interesting things that we implemented about a month ago was the dangerous subscriber program. It turns out that if you show up with a truck and decide to turn off disconnect the cable, they're heavily armed, very heavily armed, it turns out. And so you have to keep track of the subscribers that are going to shoot you if you send a truck to the property, because they will. They literally will.
Where do I find customers like that?
Down in Florida in a trailer park. And it turns out that somewhere around 6–8% of those folks don't have power for significant periods of time. But when there's a big sporting event coming on, the really cool thing is they'll suddenly drum up the money for power, so they get the Florida Power and Light to come to turn electricity on. They'll somehow drum up some money to get us to turn the video back on again, and then they have just the right amount of money left over to buy a few six-packs of beer. So it's quite a diverse customer base. And I don't think I'm going to kind of skip through these kinds of things, but people who have dealt with this are familiar with all the kinds of things we do. The company, when it first started off, decided they were going to be the premier, the elite, the super service, no VRU. When you call in, you're always going to get an agent. You're always going to get picked up in 6 seconds or whatever the metric was. And so they decided to create this super crazy flexible things for wives and homeowners and renters and all of these kinds of things, which just basically added to the complexity. Yeah, and these are just some properties that we deal with. And then it's who signs the legal contracts. Of course, they sign the legal contracts. We keep the legal contracts online. And then we also, somehow or another, somewhere along the way, some salesman decided to get into student housing and decided to sell that as well, with all the complexities of student housing. And not only that, decided to make it so it was just what the students wanted instead of what the billing system could actually do. So we had to retrofit that back in. And then the business morphed over time. When it first started, we were doing what was the company calls greenfields development, which were brand new properties. We dug trenches, we laid fiber to the home, and basically gave people, gigabit connections out to the world, which was kind of nice. But then the whole real estate market imploded, and nobody built any more homes. So it was, well, you better think of something fast or go out of business. So then the company got into retrofits, which was basically mostly apartment blocks. And then it actually changed again, and is mostly now the new customers are mostly coming in through reseller arrangements, and mostly from the video side. And a couple of examples of promotions and credits and adjustments that we had to deal with. Yeah. It's amazing how you can make minor mistakes in dates. And does the first day fall? Do you get what happens on the first day, what happens on the last day, making sure you don't have overlaps and all that kind of stuff. And we built a whole tool so that we can create the custom, so that the end users can create the promotions. What was interesting is one of the biggest provider in the country, I think, 50 or 60 million subs. They have to go to the IT department in order to create promotions, credits, or change prices. Here, the marketing guys can actually just go in the system and fiddle with promotions and pricing and create them on the fly. The call center agents can create credits on the fly and all that kind of stuff. And, of course, the billing system has to be able to handle all of that. And, of course, the usual thing that you have to deal with the window. The worst one, of course, is when people cancel. So on and so forth. Andrew doesn't know this yet, but there's a new one coming up where it turns out that in the trailer parks, there's about 5.5 million what are called underserved customers that a lot of the bigger providers don't want to deal with, because they'll order the service and a month and a half later they'll cancel the service, and then of course you've never gotten any money. So that makes it a very unattractive business, which is why most of the big vendors don't want to deal with that market segment. But it's a big enough segment. The bigger players, there's, measured in tens of thousands, the number that they're growing per year or losing per year. And when they're growing or losing, someone else is on the opposite side. Everybody's gain is everybody's loss, because there is no new households being formed, or very few new households being formed. And so what we're going to have to build next is prepay and support of prepay, so that you collect the money up front rather than later. And, of course, the credits for cancellations. We'll skip through that. Because of this underserved market, collections turned out to be the biggest issue. And it turns out why the company was actually quite successful. There's something called temporary disconnect. So I had the CEO of the largest provider in the country come to us, and he was at a meeting at the facility. And he goes, and so one of our one of the folks from our side asked him, well, how come you gave us this great contract to take over this big customer base? He goes, well, you're the only people in the country who can do temporary disconnects as fast and as efficiently as anybody out there. So you have to be able to discover that someone's not going to pay you, and then you've got to be able to turn them off real quick, and then when the sporting event is coming up, you got to be able to turn them back on real quick, and you got to be able to do that without sending someone out to the property and getting shot. So, interesting. And there's the whole account state diagram, and this is, again, a simplification, but people get disconnected, they get reconnected, they get permanently disconnected, they somehow drum up some money, and you get them to pay up front, or you get them to pay on a credit card, and you go round and round in circles with third-party collections and everything else. So we had to deal with all of this. We ended up buying, fortunately, there's a couple of commercial packages. Without the commercial package, there's no chance that we would have been able to do any of this stuff. But they essentially give you some tables, you load the tables, and you have to be smart about how you load the tables because they're pretty big, and you've got to struggle with a lot of performance issues. Surcharges, there's a whole bunch of tax mappings, payment control. Yeah, that's the other, the payments come in, they come in through lockboxes, they get applied to the billing system, they get applied to the accounting system, which is the system of record for the balances. And then, but of course, the call center has to be able to provide credits on the fly when there's been mistakes. So you've got to keep all of this straight between the accounting system and the billing system and make sure that certain things only happen in certain places. And occasionally somebody in accounting will get clever and violate one of those things and create some chaos. But that seems to have settled down now. We haven't had much trouble with that in about the last 8-9 months. Voice calls, basically you have to be able to figure out where the call came from, where it's going to, and what kind of tariff to apply to it. Skip through that. And of course, you've got to be able to generate an invoice. And we decided to go with PDFs, so you can email it, you can see them on the web self-care site, the call center can see them, and we store those away. Couple of things, the bill cycle checklist. You're not going to run everything all on one day of the month. So you're going to end up breaking up the properties into bill cycles. Those bill cycles, you're going to put, a couple thousand properties per bill cycle, and you try to keep a couple of bill cycles per week. So that all has to be done. New tax tables come in constantly. You got to make sure all the taxes are mapped properly so that the billing system knows how to deal with them. Of course, you've got to keep all the postings have to be, just simple things like people pay their bills, it goes into the lockbox. It got, one time, and then it gets posted into the accounting system. It gets loaded into the accounting system, but for whatever reason, it wasn't posted. So now, then you can guess within a week, these things are all sitting there in some queue on the accounting system. Within a week, the call center goes nuts because people go look at all of a sudden are getting late notices for non-payments because they're very aggressive about doing that. So you got to make sure that everybody does their part. And of course, you can see it spans all of the departments in the company. And the most troublesome one, I think, is mostly marketing. There is an interesting story, and this is not a lie. Andrew is my witness. One of them came to me. He was the senior VP of marketing. He's not there anymore. But he decided he wanted animated GIFs on the bill. And I scratched my head for a while, and somebody's laughing. Don't laugh. And I go, exactly how are you going to put an animated GIF on a printed invoice? And he scratched his head. Well, it's easy, isn't it? And I'm, sure, guy. I said, somebody that's older, remember those little cartoon things where they had like 100 pages and you'd flip through them and it would look like an animation? Yeah. Marketing thinks of all of these wild things that you have to contend with. A couple of statistics. There's about 100 million in annual bills being generated right now. By the end of the year, I expect it to be around 200 million. There's a couple of contracts pending that the letter of intents are signed where one of the really giant vendors that has many tens of millions of subscribers has a lot of the lower end, the 5.5 million lower end market segment units that they're losing their shirt on, and they're about to hand this over, so that would be another 300 million in billings potentially coming through. So it's not a small billing system. It's handling fairly substantial volume, where it's doing many hundreds of millions in billings. And then the thing that bulling, I see I spelled billing very well on this slide, the bulling-related call volumes. The interesting thing is about half the call volume used to be billing. Now it's down to about 8 or 9% on the average month. We've had the occasional mistake where things weren't posted or something happened in accounting or somewhere where the call volume went up. But it's actually lower. The call volume, since we've implemented this, is below the industry average. So the system does actually produce reliable, good bills. We've been audited, so certain states will come in, and the state of Florida came in and audited the company, and we passed the audit. We were able to validate all of the taxes and everything that we paid, and they turned out to be correct, which was pretty good. The 11,000 micro markets. Oh, yes. Yep. Yeah, those millions, they knew that the taxes were incorrect, so they always automatically prepaid the fines for. You may as well just send the state the money up front because you know you're not doing your taxes right, and they would happily get this estimated check of what we thought they'd owe them, and as long as we overpaid them, then the most states turned out to be quite happy with that. And so now we actually remit the right amount of taxes on time and are not paying any more fines, which turned out to be a pretty good hunk of money. It also has expanded. In the reselling arena, the company is now the largest reseller, larger than the big players in terms of how much reselling volume they do for DirecTV, which was kind of an interesting number, bigger than like. I think AT&T does some reselling. I don't know if they still do or not. Can't remember. It's also now, they discovered that since it's so good at this and a lot of other companies, that some RBOX, regional bell companies, who are also into some of these markets, they've decided, and I think Andrew's got the wind of this one already, we have to be able to do third-party billing now too. The first one was floating through in about a month, where we're doing billing for somebody else, and then eventually we'll be doing one for a large name brand, nationally known company has decided to outsource the billing because the sales guys have decided that we can do this. If I don't have a heart attack or a stroke by then, we might actually do it, but who knows. The performance. The performance was the biggest gain. The original architecture of the commercial system had an Oracle database, and they had a Java application that was really well written, really flexible, really structured. It took about 8 hours to do one of the properties. When we had completed it, we were able to accomplish the same thing in just under 3 minutes. So we got an extraordinary performance difference between the top-of-the-line commercial application and what we were using and what we ended up billing. The other thing is we have lots of room for performance enhancements. You know, the dependency engine was written in a programming language. Andrew ended up rewriting it in PL/SQL, right? I think, yeah, you rewrote it, and then we used, then we did a round of performance tuning when we migrated to Postgres 9, and then I did another round of performance tuning. But we're essentially able to get the dependency engine to go from literally running most of the day to do the QA. Got it down to about half an hour on our biggest property. So we know that there's another round left in it. And right now it's only rating one property at a time. When we wrote it so it can handle multiple properties in parallel. And if we've got, we'll buy another server, probably, a 32-core server kind of thing, or 64-core server, whatever money can buy these days. And we should be able to rate multiple properties at a time, which we'll need to, because we're starting to do outsourced billing for national scale vendors now. Some of the things already are parallelized. I'll let Andrew talk about that. But the biggest thing is the bills used to run about 2 months late. One of the bills actually ran we actually fell 6 months behind when we were using the commercial package because we couldn't get all the rating done on time. So now all the bills go out on time. I haven't had any late bills in the last year that I know of. In fact, they're now going out a few days early. We've just added an extra feature where the invoice date is calculated more carefully to allow the bill to go out earlier. So that's a quick and dirty on why would you build a billing system, because you didn't have any choice. I'll turn that over to Andrew then.